All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's reading, A World of Magic. We'll be hearing from Sally Stevens, reading from the Odyssey of Mrs. Naomi Billingsley, which was released January 12th. Kellye Abernathy reading from Amethyst, The Shallows, released February 6th, and AnneMarie Mazotti Gouveia reading from Mirror Tree, released February 20th. All three authors' books can be purchased both from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, you can order the books on Atmosphere Press's website at atmospherepress.com/books. And I'll also put some links in the chat for you. At the end of today's event, we will have time for audience questions. So during the readings, if you have a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type that in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. And then during the actual reading itself, please stay muted so we can keep extraneous sound at a minimum. Of course, you are always welcome to use the chat for praise and comments as well as any questions. And one last note before we begin the readings. We at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. So if you have a book manuscript of your own, we would love to read it. You can submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Sally, Kellye, and AnneMarie today. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Sally Stevens. In addition to her singing performances and work as a vocal contractor and choral director, Sally is the author of I Sang That, a memoir from Hollywood, which was published by Atmosphere Press in 2022. She has had short stories, poems, and essays published in The Offbeat, Mocking Heart Review, Raven's Perch, Hermeneutic Chaos Literary Journal, The Voices Project, Los Angeles Press, Between the Lines Anthology, Fairy Tales and Folklore Reimagined, Funny in 500, The Missouri Review, and No Extra Words podcast. Today we'll be hearing from the Odyssey of Mrs. Naomi Billingsley. In the world of Mrs. Naomi Billingsley, the logical, colorful experiences begin to manifest, with evidence that suggests perhaps some of her stories actually have taken place. This also raises the question of whose world her psychiatrist is actually living in, his own world or his patient's, and results in an eventual reversal of their two roles. And with that, welcome, Sally.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read a short excerpt from a couple of the first pages, and then I'm going to move deeply into the book so you get one of their adventures. So, the new patient. Dr. Bernteller was somewhat befuddled by his new patient. Not that he would ever publicly disclose this, for he had professional reputation to uphold, at least in his own mind. The degrees and certificates of honorable recognition that hung on his wall were tangible evidence of his respected position within the community. The fact that among his last patients could be found a handful of eventually institutionalized souls, and a rumor, nothing more, of one tragic, but if true, obviously unavoidable suicide, was something that the good doctor worked hard at keeping under the radar. He was, if nothing else, conscientious. He was open always to new discoveries, alert to coming across in his practice some patient that might become the subject of a new study, a presentation to his comrades in the world of shared psychiatric revelations. Mrs. Naomi Billingsley certainly appeared to have the potential for being such a patient. He reviewed the notes from her last visit as he sat in the Ames chair, his feet resting on the desk. Mrs. B reports more frequent insights of late and seems to have gotten past the discomfort of revealing her most innermost thoughts. I have observed unusual symptoms which, while viewed with normal clinical skepticism, are nonetheless fascinating to note. Patient arrived for appointment Friday with manifestations of open wounds on the backs of both hands. We discussed this phenomena with objectivity for the better part of 50 minutes. It was apparent she suffered no discomfort from the wounds and would probably not even have noticed them had I not pointed them out. First assumed they were charismatic in nature, but corrected my diagnosis later when droplets of blood were detected on the Naugahyde chaise. Note, adjust patient's billing to cover cleaning of chaise. The doctor's thoughts were interrupted by the flashing red light signaling the arrival of his patient. He arose to open the door to the inner office, and as he greeted Mrs. Billingsley, was alarmed at the sight of what appeared to be a fresh bullet wound in the woman's forehead. Yes, a clean shot. No longer bleeding, thank goodness, since he had had the carpet cleaned only a month ago. Then he reflected upon past observations of this patient and allowed for the possibility that this might have been a self-inflicted emotional wound resulting from a deep depression so profoundly felt that the patient manifested it physically. Yes, they could explore this possibility. Mrs. Billingsley seemed not at all disturbed by the bullet hole. Things obviously were beginning to move into high gear. The doctor waited diplomatically for the right opening and then chose his words carefully. Mrs. Billingsley, he asked in a clinical, matter-of-fact tone, have you become aware yet this morning of the fresh bullet wound in your forehead? Oh, that, said Mrs. Billingsley. It was probably my husband taking pot shots at me again, doctor. I am handling it so much better than I used to, thanks to your excellent help. Usually I come right back with a few of my own, which is probably why he was lying prone in the driveway as I left this morning. Rather than upset her with more insensitive inquiries, the doctor took a moment to quietly consider the various possible explanations. Perhaps he thought the wound might be the beginning of a third eye, a further expansion of her rapidly growing mystical consciousness. He didn't know a great deal about the third eye theory, but it seemed logical. Now we'll go deeper into the book. Brother Goodfellow and the Flood. Traffic had not yet thickened as Mrs. Billingsley settled in for the drive home. As she turned off the highway and drove closer, the snow had not yet been cleared off the streets of the neighborhood. Soon it became impossible to navigate, and she pulled off the road, thinking she would leave the car in the parking lot at the Mayfield Park Tent Theater and just try to walk home. She circled the parking lot several times before she finally found a spot. Irritated at the crowded lot, she grumbled a bit as she got out and locked the car. Then she remembered the reason for the crowded parking lot. Today was Fred Goodfellow's appearance in the Tent Theater. Brother Goodfellow was an evangelist whose popularity had soared in small towns as broadcasts of his weekly revival services went out to hundreds of local cable stations. He wasn't her favorite man of the cloth, but he was indeed a charismatic fellow. Further, it occurred to her that inside his tent, she would be considerably warmer than standing in the parking lot outside until the snow eased up a bit. So compromising what she considered her higher spiritual standards for the sake of avoiding frostbite, she headed for the entrance, quickly stepping inside and stood at the back of the congregation. She was amazed at the hypnotic power this preacher held over his flock. The tent was full of attentive and devoted worshipers who from time to time were moved by the Spirit to raise their waving arms and shout, "Amen, yes, brother," and other such supportive remarks. Mrs. Billingsley, grateful as she was for the warmth of the surroundings, was finding it hard to join in the spirit. She didn't see any familiar faces in the crowd and began to speculate about how a wise and loving God who could see through this kind of performance might handle things. She thought about the things he'd pulled off in the past. There was the parting of the Red Sea, but that didn't really fit this situation since no one seemed to be trying to migrate. There were the loaves and fishes. Well, Brother Goodfellow was not about to feed this crowd without a guaranteed profit margin clearly agreed upon in advance. The offering baskets were being passed for the second time since she had come in, and the musicians were stepping forward to begin another rousing number. She peeked around to the back of the tent and noticed what looked like water seeping under the double doors. Odd, the temperature must have changed dramatically outside to melt that much snow, yet it was unmistakable. Suddenly, the doors flung open and in washed a flood of water, sweeping the folding chairs and their occupants toward the front of the tent, picking up Brother Goodfellow, swirling him and the congregation out, swooping the musicians and their instruments up as well, all into the parking lot. There wasn't time to think about what was happening or to grab hold of the tent poles. Mrs. Billingsley just tried to keep her head above the surface of the rising waters and bobbed along with the rest of the crowd. The torrent of water filled now with members of the congregation trying to hold on to their handbags and their Bibles, finally letting go of their folding chairs, scanning the surface of the water for their loved ones, was rushing through the streets of Mayfield, past the snowplows, past the downtown square, past City Hall, rushing on and on, out through the farmlands and the fields, out past the railroads and cities dotted along the landscape. The entire world became a rolling sea rushing forward. "Hello, is that you, Mrs. Billingsley?" came a shout from someone floating by to her right. "Aren't Brother Goodfellow's services simply amazing?" In no time at all, it seemed, Mrs. Billingsley, along with the entire congregation, the deacons, the handbags and Bibles, and the folding chairs, were floating in the new sea that had suddenly relocated itself remarkably close to Mayfield. As the floodwaters pushed everything and everyone farther out into the waves, Mrs. Billingsley saw looming on the horizon a gigantic creature, a huge black whale dramatically rising from the water, its jaws poised in a wide open position. It occurred to her that perhaps she should alert someone to the situation, but then she remembered it was probably all part of the plan. On the waters rushed, and she could see now the mouth of the giant whale was opening wider to welcome them all in, the rush of deacons, the congregation, Brother Goodfellow, and Mrs. Billingsley herself. They tumbled in one over the other, through the whale's jaws, through his throat, and down into his belly, finally settling next to his huge liver, rather crowded and stepping on one another's toes. "Praise the Lord," said a gray-haired gentleman standing nearby. "I wasn't none too happy about coming today. My son, he's got all enthused about this Goodfellow guy, and I always been skeptical, but I gotta tell you, I ain't never experienced anything like this, not in all my years as a Christian. I'm pretty well sold." Mrs. Billingsley herself wasn't terribly comfortable with the situation, but tried to remain calm in order to quietly evaluate things. Brother Goodfellow, always on the lookout for an opportunity to seize focus, obviously saw this whole thing as an opportunity for strengthening faith. So he climbed up on the shoulders of two of the larger men standing near the entrance to the throat of the whale and began shouting to the crowd. "There's no cause for concern, my beloved brothers and sisters," he cried. "We must try to remain calm and trust in the Lord. This is only a test," he assured them. The deacons made their way with the soggy collection baskets through the increasingly agitated crowd, sloshing in water up to their knees. Then Brother Goodfellow began to lead them in the singing of a hymn. "Shall we gather at the river?" he sang, but he too late realized his unfortunate choice of material. Their voices had first risen in trembling, passionate tones that echoed against the whale's solar plexus, but began to falter the minute they got to the part about the river. The irony seemed to cast a pall over the crowd. Their joyous, ringing voices quickly died down, and they began to grow angrier and more rebellious. Dinner time was approaching, and empty stomachs rumbled, the only full stomach being that of the whales. The evangelist soon realized he was losing control when his flock began to rush at him, pummeling him with their Bibles and fighting one another for optimum positions that might allow them access to air and an occasional peek out through the whale's mouth. Eventually, the vibrations caused by the milling about of all the angry, hungry worshipers began to cause the whale to have extreme indigestion. The sides of his stomach rippled in a reflex action, his body's effort to eject the offending foreign objects, and the crowd again began to be tossed and swirled about, the ripples moving them closer and closer to the opening of the whale's throat. Brother Goodfellow saw what was happening and frantically tried to formulate a brief sermon, claiming credit for the release of the crowds from their imprisonment. "You see, the Lord has heard our prayers, as he always does when we tithe appropriately. Redemption is at hand. Do not be afraid, my brothers and sisters." Soon, most of the congregation had pretty much been swept out through the jaws, save for a few hardy souls who were reluctant to leave the reverend's side. One of the deacons was huddled with him, both of them speaking intensely now in energetic tones. Then Brother Goodfellow patted his colleague on the back, took a pad and pen out of his coat pocket, and began to scribble something frantically. The whale's interior was nearly empty now, save for Brother Goodfellow, the deacon beside him, one other worshiper whose jacket had gotten caught on one of the whale's back teeth, and Mrs. Billingsley. The spasmodic stomach ripplings began to ease a bit. The deacon grabbed the pad from Brother Goodfellow and tried to hand it to the last worshiper, untangling him from the whale's tooth. But once the man was loose, he somersaulted on by and soon was out of reach. They looked around desperately and then spotted Mrs. Billingsley. "Dear madam," Brother Goodfellow shouted, realizing she was the last person remaining, "a divine thought has just occurred to us. Why not broadcast the revival service right from this spot, right from the belly of the whale? We've written a note to the network proposing the plan, but we must get it out safely. Please, dear lady, can you deliver it for us?" They both now were clinging to the whale's tonsils, resisting the propelling motion that was sweeping past them. It was somewhat a stroke of brilliance, Mrs. Billingsley had to admit. Realizing she'd better act fast or risk becoming a permanent fixture inside the whale, she grabbed the note from the Reverend's hand and waved goodbye as the final reflexive thrust of the whale's belly carried her out through the jaws and suddenly and miraculously deposited her into the parking lot of the Mayfield Tent Theater, where she landed with a thud. She shook herself free of the residual salt water drippings, found her car in the crowded lot, and managed to get back on the road. The streets had cleared enough that she was able to make good progress toward home. She thought about Brother Goodfellow and the deacon there in the belly of the whale, joyfully anticipating the next exciting level of their ministry. It was impressive, she had to admit, but at best, it would be a while before the network heads could agree on this new proposal, as you really had to have been there. Brother Goodfellow and his friend would have to survive on the undigested bits of octopus and shark floating around in the confines of their new studio. They would probably lose a few pounds waiting for the network crew to show up, she thought, which could only improve their on-screen appeal. She would have to find a way to get his note to the gentleman at the Christian Broadcasting Network as soon as possible, despite her lack of enthusiasm. But wait, she thought. If this was truly a divine inspiration, the idea would surely have occurred to the network heads and Brother Goodfellow simultaneously. They would think of it with or without the note from him. The light of truth would illuminate at once all beings of faith, and they were probably already on their way to the whale with the crew. This might just be an opportunity for an excellent test of faith. Mrs. Billingsley reached into her pocket and pulled out Brother Goodfellow's note. She rolled the car window down just enough to reach her hand out and send the note floating into the whirling, tossing snow. She watched it dance up into the wind, sweep off in the distance, and gradually drift out of sight. She experienced a brief moment of remorse in light of the possibility that she might have just interfered with divine destiny. But the moment passed quickly, and she smiled, anticipating the ease with which she might be able to find a parking place at the Tent Theater next time she got stuck in a snowstorm during the revival meeting season. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Your reading is just so dynamic. I feel like it was really what we needed to bring these visions of Naomi's to life. Or should I say experiences, perhaps? All right, so reading next tonight is Kellye Abernathy. Kellye is a former business executive, happily transformed into a yoga teacher and practical life skills advocate for trauma survivors. She believes in creatively building unique and supportive communities, one relationship at a time. A graduate of the University of Kansas, she holds a Bachelor of Science degree in secondary English education. She lives in the landlocked Plano, Texas, dreaming of her next trip to the sea. You can find her at kellyeabernathy.com. In the YA novel Amethyst, The Shallows, the aftermath of a devastating sickness that shatters their close-knit beach town draws together 6 lonely kids during the unpredictable autumn equinox. Guided by a wise surf master, mystical old women known as the Beachlings, and an open-hearted grandmother, 6 kids embark on transformative adventures that challenge their beliefs about possibilities and the intense nature of love. We'll hear more now from Kellye herself. Kellye, you might just have to unmute. Oh, I wonder if perhaps she's having connectivity issues. I'm not actually seeing her in the meeting anymore. Okay, well, in the hopes that Kellye is just trying to connect to the internet again, I think we can move forward to our third reader, and then once Kellye's able to rejoin, we can get her back in for her reading. So with that being said, we're actually going to jump now to our third, now second reader of the evening, who is AnneMarie. AnneMarie was born and raised in California. She's traveled through Europe and has lived in Germany, Washington, and Kansas. A former high-tech executive with a Bachelor of Science in Information Technology, she is a geek at heart who enjoys mentoring others and trips to Disneyland. Mirror Tree is the second book in her Drifter's Realm book series. She is a member of SBCWI and the Mount Diablo CWC. Find her at AnneMarieMazottiGouveia.com. In Mirror Tree, Book 2 of the Drifter's Realm Fantasy Adventure series, 12-year-old triplets Ori, Ro, and Tora, along with their older brother Theo, must trust their unpredictable magic and each other. Together, they attempt to stop the Guardians, whose supernatural powers are controlled by their uncle, First City Leader Zane, who is determined to impose his oppressive rule beyond their realm. And with that, let's welcome AnneMarie.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. So I'm going to be reading from chapter 1, and it's titled Saving Theo the Lion. A teenage boy screamed desperately in the dark, "Help me!" as Ro ran through Drifter's Square, her pale green eyes blinking wildly, while tears streamed down her face from the smoke-filled air. The injured teenager was impossible to see through the confusion and damage created by the battle. Rose stumbled, cutting her leg on a fallen branch. Thick smoke burned her throat as she dodged exploded trees and what remained of First City's outdoor market and gathering area. The battle with the Guardians in the square had ended less than an hour ago, but the chaos continued as teenagers ran for safety. All around her, 100-year-old oak trees lay uprooted and burned uncontrolled. Heavy smoke billowed into the night sky, blotting out the stars. Bloodied teenagers made their way in small groups back to First City for bandaging after being hit by many lightning bolts that were hurled at them during the battle with the Guardians. Even though she didn't regret returning to Drifter Square, she couldn't stop thinking about how she had left Ori, her twin brother, earlier that night at the entrance to Great Dismal North. She had pulled her hand away from his and ran into the night without an explanation. Ori was probably sick with worry over her disappearance, but she had to return to Drifter Square to find their older brother, Theo the Lion, before it was too late. Family meant everything to her since her parents mysteriously disappeared 2 years ago, and she wasn't about to leave Theo the Lion in the sandstone tunnels under First City. The network of tunnels led to forbidden places, including the underground prison and up into the First City buildings, where a dozen teenagers lived and worked with the leaders of Drifter's Realm. Ro felt foolish for having listened to Ori when he told her Theo the Lion would be okay if they left him behind, because he was the biggest lion in Drifter's Realm. What was Ori thinking? Theo was still their brother, and the Guardians were incredibly dangerous. An angry, 9-foot shimmering indigo-colored Guardian floated across the square near Ro. Steering away from the Guardian's path, she ran to the far corner of Drifter Square, to a secret entrance that led to the tunnels under First City. The entrance bypassed the solar fence, taking her underground. Rose squeezed through the narrow cleft in the stones, tearing her pale blue dress and scraping her knee, then headed down the main tunnel to a dozen connecting tunnels. The oil lamps on the tunnel walls flickered eerily, casting dark shadows in every direction, making all the tunnels look the same, confusing her on which way she should go. Rose smelled burnt fur, and panic filled her heart. Was she too late? Was her brother already dead? Rose clutched her sacred ring, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer for Theo the lion to still be alive. Her ring was silver and felt warm to the touch. Ori had an identical ring. Their rings had 3 intertwined vines and a pale yellow stone with a golden aura at the center. Her mother told them the rings would protect them from harm and had secret powers. Rose waited until she was certain she was alone in the tunnel before letting her ring shine its bright yellow light. Thick smoke filled the tunnel the farther she walked. She paused for a moment, trying to catch her breath, but it was no use. She felt faint and began to panic. Then, remembering what her father taught her, she focused on the yellow light of her ring, steadied her heartbeat, and summoned a pale blue mist from her flowered backpack. The mist swirled around her, clearing the smoke from the air. Rose hesitated for a split second, thinking she should turn back and help the injured teenager in the square. Her obligation was a life giver, like her father, and her flowered backpack held items she could summon with her mind to heal the hurt. But she shook her head no, steadied herself, and ran down the next tunnel. As she made her way zigzagging through the maze of tunnels, she found it impossible to believe that an hour ago, her friends from Bliss, Eden, and Paradise Farms, along with the Menace, fought the Guardians in Drifter Square to free her twin brother Ori and Hal, the leader of the Menace, from First City's underground prison. The Guardians were ancient spiritual beings and keepers of the peace in Drifter's realm. But something was wrong with them. Rose had known for weeks that someone was poisoning their spirits, changing the Guardians' shimmering auras from pearl-colored to indigo, putting everyone in Drifter's realm in danger of the Guardians' deadly powers. Rose stopped at a fork in the tunnel that branched off in 2 different directions, trying to decide which way to go. She placed her hands against the cool tunnel wall on the left, feeling the sandy grit against her fingertips and palms as she leaned over to catch her breath. The explosive scene of meeting Tora for the first time earlier that night and their narrow escape flashed through her mind, catching her off guard. She pushed her back against the tunnel wall in fear. It was like reliving what happened all over again as the scene unfolded inside her head. She and Theo the lion had been roaming the tunnels searching for Tora, leader Quinlan's daughter. Rose was going to talk to her about her father's life plan, which was causing an uprising that would lead to a war in Drifter's realm. Rose remembered Theo the lion turning the final tunnel corner while fireworks exploded above them in Drifter Square. A girl moved out of the shadows of the tunnel unexpectedly and faced them. The next thing Rose remembered, she and Theo the lion were thrown into the tunnel wall, with Theo the lion taking the brunt of the hit. Rose then rolled in the sand and launched herself to her feet as lightning sparks flew off the girl's fingertips, electrifying the air around them. Seeing Rose for the first time was like looking at her own reflection on the smooth surface of the lily pond back in Paradise Farm. Seconds later, Ori found them in the tunnel. They argued with Tora about Leader Quinlan, the menace, and what was really going on in Drifter's realm. His name is not Quinlan. His name is Zane. He's your uncle and not your father. Rose's words echoed through her head as she said them to a stunned Tora. But the most shocking news was this strange girl who nearly killed them was their sister, Tora, a storm catcher. The three of them, Ori, Ro, and Tora, were triplets, and Leader Quinlan was Zane, their long-lost uncle. An angry guardian with many lightning bolts suddenly appeared while they were arguing, and they ran for their lives through the tunnels. Tora led them through a secret passageway where they then crossed the Drifter Square battlefield. From there, they ran to the entrance of Great Dismal North, where Ro pulled her hand away from Ori's in the dark. The flashback was suddenly over. Ro opened her eyes and looked around her. She had unknowingly slid down the tunnel wall and was sitting on the ground. She took a deep breath and pushed the memory of meeting Tora and abandoning Ori to the back of her mind. She stood up slowly, brushed her tangled hair out of her eyes, and stared down the length of the tunnel in front of her. She knew it was useless to dwell on what had happened. If her father were here, he would tell her not to look back. There was nothing she could do except to keep moving forward and find Theo the lion. It was a long walk to where she had left him, and there was plenty of time to think about how her family and friends ended up here while she walked. Remembering her past, it was hard to believe her gifting ceremony was only 6 months ago, on her 12th birthday. That day, she received her life-giver obligation and flowered backpack. Back then, life had been simple on Paradise Farm with Theo, growing plants for food and healing, and learning how to use her magical backpack while the guardians watched over them. The farms in Drifter's realm lived in peace and harmony with First City. Their ancestors created Drifter's realm a few hundred years before the Great War as a safe place for teenagers to live while learning how to use their backpack powers. Drifter's realm laws forbid weapons of any kind. According to her father, before the Great War, people traveled in strangely shaped crafts on the ground and in the sky, destroying the planet's natural resources. Everyone had small rectangular things they stared at, missing the beauty in front of them. People lost sight of their humanity and spirituality. The Great War ended that way of life, ushering in what existed in her day. Rose's flowered backpack was important to her and everyone else in Drifter's realm, since she was the realm's only life giver. Like all the other teenagers who lived on Bliss, Paradise, and Eden farms, her unique backpack included everything she needed until she turned 18. It came with 100 different items, but as a first year, Ro could keep 20 in her backpack at any given time. The size of the 20 items didn't matter. The items would fit. After she turned 18, like all drifters, she would give up her backpack and travel to Earth to live with other adults in peace and harmony. As Ro walked faster through the tunnel, hoping she wasn't too late to save her brother, she clenched her fists at her sides. Anger flowed through her like a raging fire, making her head throb and her heart pound. This mess is all Zane's fault. Her words echoed eerily down the length of the tunnel. Months ago, his secret life plan had leaked to the farms. Soon after, teenagers started disappearing from the farms at night, but no one knew why. First city leaders called the runaway teenagers the Menace, a name that stuck with them, and declared the Menace a threat to life in Drifter's Realm.
Thank you, AnneMarie. Your young main characters clearly have a lot to contend with, even in such a brief reading. So I can tell there's a lot of tension there. But thank you for sharing. At this point, we will now move to Kellye Abernathy for her reading. I did introduce Kelly's bio earlier, but just to refresh what we'll be hearing from in her book today, in the YA novel Amethyst, The Shallows, the aftermath of a devastating sickness that shatters their close-knit beach town draws together 6 lonely kids during the unpredictable autumn equinox. Guided by a wise surf master, mystical old women known as the Beachlings, and an open-hearted grandmother, 6 kids embark on transformative adventures that challenge their beliefs about possibilities and the intense nature of love. And now I'm happy to welcome Kellye to read.
Unmute. Thank you very much, Ayla. I'll be reading from Amethyst, The Shallows, and this is the beginning, the autumn equinox. It is the magical hour before dawn. An old woman strides purposely across the sand, balancing a large woven basket on her shoulder, moonlight sparkling on the braid of pewter hair coiled upon her head. Ribbons of mist twist off the waves, unfurling over the indigo black waters of a sleeping sea. The air is thick and laced with night dew, sand slaked with foam and moon shadow. At the waterline, she bends gracefully, setting the basket down. Squatting, she uses her hands to dig deep into a cluster of air bubbles, unearthing a bounty of clams. Incoming waves crash over her, drenching her old bleached dress, tugging at the net tied loosely around her waist. She doesn't mind. Cold cannot touch her. Her steady old heart beats to the cadence of the tides for more moons than most can remember. The water peels back. Quickly, she fills the basket to the brim. Standing erect, hands on hips, she sniffs the air, searching for that certain curl of cool, signaling the change of the seasons. The autumn equinox is almost here, an unpredictable time when a quirk of the moon presses the tide to run wild. Placing the basket above the waterline, she hurries to the long layered slab of granite rock known as Craggy Point. Climbing with speed and deftness, she ascends to the high shelf, the one overlooking the sea. A smattering of starlight dapples the rock and the wind tugs gently at her dress. Carefully, she steps to the edge of the shelf. Anchoring her feet, she breathes in, tightening her gaze. Breathing out, she scans the sea. No time to waste. She has many mouths to feed. It will be impossible to keep the secret much longer. Crack! The jolt rumbles through the rock, almost knocking her off her feet. Crouching, she grabs the ledge, waiting for the shaking to cease. She is unafraid, as she well understands the ways of the ocean. The great underwater volcano, a few miles offshore, is tuning to the equinox, resetting the ocean currents. The small quake is a warning. The weather may hold for several days, but a significant storm is on the way. Rising, she steps to the lip of the ledge and surveys the dark water. The bioluminescent bands spin, a galaxy of sea enzymes, twinkling, dancing lights. Beneath the waves, in the heart of the vortex, a ripening sea harvest awaits. Fat grapes of sapphire kelp, heavy with nectar, and clusters of plump sea strawberries are being released from the deep caverns. During the change of seasons, summer to autumn, these mighty ocean plants are faithful, producing the best medicines the sea can yield. Untying the net looped around her waist, she breathes deeply, face to the moon. Rising high on her toes, she lifts her arms, braid falling loose, spilling silver down her back. Making an arcing dive through curls of mist, she pierces the heart of the light bands, disappearing into the sea. It will be a long while before she surfaces. An expert free diver, the old woman can hold her breath underwater for extended minutes. Suspended in the deep, she will gather the precious plants, moving like a meditation. When she emerges from the waves, the net will be full. Dawn will be breaking, sprinkling rose and gold light on her brine-crusted hair, glazing the harvested sea plants with shine. No one knows how she does it. How can one so old dive so far and so deep? The truth is, no one knows. To the town, she is simply Traponica, leader of the beachlings, the tribe of mysterious old women who have lived in Dipodus Beach for as long as anyone can remember. On the high terrace of the yellow cottage overlooking the cove, Grandella stretches her arms to the sky, basking in the salt-laced air of early morning. Today, the sea is gentle, ripples of teal and amethyst ruffling the shore with foam. Gazing out at the horizon line, she sets the rhythm of her breath, matching it to the ebb and flow of the sea. Thankfully, her body feels stronger today, though there's no doubt her recent battle with the sickness has taken quite a toll. Inside the cottage, her beloved granddaughter, Condi, remains asleep in the loft. Twisting the silver chain of her infinity necklace, Grandella wonders what the day will bring. The long, isolating months of lockdown have left a cruel mark on her granddaughter's spirits. For too many days, when the weather was fine, Grandella watched Condi climb the stone stairs to the top of Windy Hollow, a tall tower of rock on the loneliest tip of the cove. There, tucked between the two half-moon rocks, Condi sat cross-legged on the old upside-down orange-red rescue kayak, staring out to sea. Grandella didn't ask why Condi spent hours alone on the top of the hollow. She knew, without the company of friends, hours weigh heavily on a young soul. When a mercurial surfer boy named Trustin Davis left town last year, a part of Condi's heart went with him. The top of the hollow had been their special place. One by one, the lights in the town of Dipodus Beach blink awake, the homes of the inner cove twinkling into the promise of a new day. The lights blaze in the kitchen of the Arundale's bread and breakfast on the top of the hill. Grandella wonders how bookish Casey Arundale is faring. An only child, Casey lives with his parents in the charming B&B, closed for almost a year, like the other beach hotels. On the top of Upper Main, a bright light flickers on in the casement window of the gloomy Hardy mansion. The head of a dark-haired girl appears, silhouetted against the light. Grandella smiles. 17-year-old Kate Dooley, taking some air. Much needed, no doubt. Newly arrived from Ireland before the sickness struck, Kate is stuck inside the dark walls of the rambling mansion, caring for querulous old Mary Hardy. On the far southern shore, the nightlights on the long dock of the Craggy Point Marine Sanctuary click off, signaling sunrise. A gust of wind spins across the deck of the terrace. Petals from the sea lily on the trellis scatter, releasing the spicy scents of fading summer. Placing her hands over her heart, Grandella bows her head. Though the contagion is passing, many have died. The sickness devastated the fragile bonds of community in her beloved beach town. A brilliant, glowing orb, the sun rises. Determined, Grandella lifts her chin. Time to reset. Things will get better. Well, because they must.
Thank you so much, Kellye. Your word choice continues to paint just beautiful pictures, just like with your first novel. So it's always a pleasure to hear that. At this time, we have about 10-15 minutes for our audience Q&A. So if you have a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type that in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. Authors, if you have questions for each other, you can definitely feel free to put those in the chat as well. But first, I wanted to start with a question for all three of you based on the theme of the event. So this question is, all of your books contain some degree of magic, from magical realism to immersive magic systems, everything in between. What draws you to use magic in your writing? So I'm wondering if we could maybe start with Kellye and then we'll go in reverse reading order.
Well, I just think the world is filled with everyday magic of all kinds, and I'm very drawn to science, and especially science as it relates to marine life and oceanography in the ocean. And to me, the ocean is literally magic in every possible way. And what we have discovered about the amazing characteristics of sea creatures and what they can do, and the fact that they actually have empathy. If we think about the octopus, for example, I feel like it just went together, those two things. And that's me.
Yeah, definitely. I hear, so many people are curious about the strangeness of the ocean, so it totally makes sense there'd be like this magical feeling to it. AnneMarie, jumping to you next, what draws you to use magic in your writing and your stories?
Well, I've always believed that where magic exists, anything is possible. And in a world full of teenagers who are living out of their backpacks, magic was necessary. And I think that magic can take people to places they may not be able to go otherwise. And I wanted a book, a true adventure story, where people could feel like they were part of what was happening to these teenagers. And in the world that I created, there is no technology. There are no cars, there are no airplanes, no cell phones. They live on farms. And because they are teenagers and living away from their families, magic was just an essential part of the story. And so to me, the story couldn't have been written unless it had included magic.
Definitely. I love to read about teenagers using magic, and as a teen, I loved that. So that totally resonates with me. Sally, closing us out on this one, what drew you to use this interesting kind of magic in your novel?
Well, it's not exactly magic, really. It's kind of, I started this book many, many years ago, and it was sort of self-defense against a crazy therapist that I was seeing at the time. And I took me down another road, and I'm afraid it's Mrs. Billingsley kind of turned into my alter ego over the chapters. But I wanted to create this world where she was escaping to, even if it was only in her own mind, but you had to see it. So I don't have a lot of experience, obviously, with writing about magical things, but this has been fun.
Mhm.
She kind of gets back to her realistic world by the middle of the book, and the doctor goes in the other direction.
Mhm. I mean, I think there's a certain kind of magic in an interesting therapist experience. So, and that really reads so well in what she shared with us today. So we've got another question. This is for AnneMarie from Catherine. The mirror tree is filled with an amazing array of characters. So how did you decide who got the different powers?
Yeah, so I wanted, because the book is written, even though one of the main characters is a teenage girl, there are other characters in the story that are not. They're boys, they're teenage boys. So I wanted there to be an equal balance of power between somebody that could heal and protect people like Ro versus someone like Howe, who you find out in the story is a chemist and he's able to, blow stuff up. So for me, it was sort of picking and choosing and making sure that there was a balance, but not quite, meaning that throughout the story, they're sort of out of balance because there's this obligation called a sorcerer that had been banned. And now all of a sudden, Ro's brother, Ori, ends up being a sorcerer, which is sort of conflicting with Ro and what she is as a life giver. So the intention was to create a world where these magical abilities that these teenagers have would sort of be topsy-turvy. You've got everything from an inventor to a maker to a storm catcher, and they're all able to do different things. But how I picked who would get what, I went for the more powerful things to be held by the main characters, but I still made some of the secondary characters like Seth, the navigator. He's quite powerful, but you don't really know until you get to the end of the book how powerful he truly is.
Well,
Yeah, I love this idea of kind of balancing different characters, but not totally balancing them because you need that tension, right?
Right.
So really interesting stuff. Now we have a question. This is for Sally from Laura. You've written in many genres. Which is your favorite and why?
Well, my goodness. I, I, I've, I've, I've written a lot of flash fiction that was focused primarily on humor or absurdity. Um, I enjoyed very much working on my memoir because I've kept journals for decades and decades. So there was a lot of material to go back and pull from. But I think mostly I enjoy writing humor, even if it's tongue in cheek or subtle or um, that's kind of the genre that I enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, what better genre to just have some fun with, right? We've got a question. This is for Kellye and AnneMarie. Um, this person says, both of your books are follow-ups to a first book, so was it easier to write the first or second book in your series? And if you could tell us a little bit about why. I know with AnneMarie's book, it's a direct sequel, and with Kellye's, it's more like a companion novel, but maybe Kellye, do you want to start us off with this one?
oh, wow. That's a fun question. Um, I think writing the second one, I don't know if I would say it was easier, but I knew my world. So I already had immersed myself in this beach town, this imaginary beach town called Dipitous Beach, short for serendipitous. So that helped a lot. But immediately I realized, oh, there's all sorts of new kids and characters that need to come into this world. And so then I was back to that place where I really, really had to sit with those characters and get to know them before I could proceed with the writing. So I actually probably wrote more drafts of Amethyst than I did of the Aquamarine Surfboard.
Yeah, I can imagine it seems like it would be easier to write a sequel, but I feel like there's more limitations placed on you, so it can kind of almost become more complex in that way. AnneMarie, what about you? Do you agree, disagree? Which one was easier for you to write?
Actually, I loved writing both books. I mean, I couldn't type fast enough, honestly, when I sat down to write Drifter's Realm. And for anybody that read Drifter's Realm or decides to read it, it's full of cliffhangers. I mean, you are literally left wondering and wanting to know more by design, because the series has 3 books. And writing Mirror Tree was just an extension of that. And because I had done a lot of world building in Drifter's Realm, with the creation of places like the Unforgettable Forest, Impossible Lake, the Wandering Plains, the Sleeping Giants, and naming all the places where the kids lived, Bliss Farm, Eden Farm, Paradise Farm, it was really easy to just sort of fall, like what Kellye was saying, into what I had built. And the story just took off like a house on fire, honestly. And I'm actually halfway through writing the 3rd book now, only because I know how the trilogy ends. And so it's just a matter of letting it all unravel and play out.
Yeah, following the characters you've created now that they've kind of become people of their own.
Yes.
Um, we've just got one more question. This is for Sally. In your bio, it mentioned you published a memoir. So what was the most different thing about writing your memoir and this novel?
Well, the memoir came first, but I had done tons of writing workshops at the University of Iowa over the years, the summer workshops. This will be my 24th summer going back if I can go. And I've written poetry and political stuff. And the memoir was kind of a chance to include all of that. It addresses my 60 years in the music business, which has just been a wonderful journey I'm so grateful for. And it touches on family, and it touches on politics. It touches on the unions, SAG and AFTRA, and how they work, and childhood a little bit. So I think I've gotten off track with the question a little bit. Did I?
More, the question is about what was the most different thing between publishing the memoir and the novel?
Well, it felt totally different to get this second book out, partially because I didn't really know who the audience was going to be, who the readers were going to be. The other one was more focused on people connected to the business or interested in the business, but this one is just kind of whoever it finds out there.
Yeah, kind of a more broad reaching out to the universe and to readers.
Yes, I just
All right. Well, at this point, I just want to say that it was so wonderful to hear all 3 of these books and the voices of their creators. So truly, thank you to Sally, Kellye, and AnneMarie for being generous with us today, sharing your words, your thoughts about everything. And thank you to everyone in the audience for being here with us so we can celebrate these authors together. Don't forget that you can order The Odyssey of Mrs. Naomi Billingsley, Amethyst, The Shallows, and Mirror Tree from the links that I've just posted one more time in the chat. And please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com, where you can browse our new and forthcoming releases, sign up for our email newsletter, and submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and just let us know that you attended today's event. So we'll look forward to hearing from you. But other than that, that's it. So have a great rest of your week, everyone.
Thank you so much, Hayla. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.